On the evening of March 17th, 2024, a Sunday, 16 million Americans sat down to watch a documentary about the children's television network that had raised them. The first images were familiar: an orange logo, bright studio lights, a 10-year-old girl in a sketch wig making an audience of children scream with laughter. The footage was from 1996. The girl was Amanda Bynes. Then the image changed. The studio lights became interview lighting. The children became adults, seated in chairs, speaking carefully into cameras. A man named Drake Bell, 37 years old, looked directly at the lens and said that he had been harmed at 15 by a dialogue coach employed by the network. The archive kept playing. And the person whose face had defined that archive, the girl in the wig, the teenager who had carried the network's biggest show, the woman whose name was inseparable from the era being examined, was not there. Amanda Bynes was 38 years old, and she was somewhere the cameras could not follow. The documentary was called Quiet on Set. It would expose workplace mistreatment, institutional silence, and the serious harm against a young performer inside one of the most trusted brands in American entertainment. But the story behind it was not only about a network or a convicted offender. It was about the families who trusted the system and the children who performed inside it. This is that story, told across 3 decades through the lives of a girl from Thousand Oaks, whose talent built an empire, the producer who controlled it, the parents who could not see all of it, and the generation of performers who grew up inside a machine that was never designed to protect them. But to understand how Amanda Bynes became the absence at the center of a national reckoning, the face everyone remembered but no one heard from, you have to go back further than the documentary, further than the conservatorship, further than the tabloid years, further than the films. You have to go back to a particular kind of American empire, one built not on land or title, but on something more volatile: the laughter of children, broadcast into millions of homes night after night for the better part of 2 decades. This is the story of a network that sold childhood back to children and made adults extraordinarily rich in the process. It is the story of a family that entered that world because their youngest daughter had a gift, and of what happened to the daughter, the family, and the empire when the cameras finally turned around. It is the story of the people who were inside the machine, the ones who built it, the ones who ran it, the ones who performed in it before they were old enough to understand what performing cost. And it begins not with scandal, but with something that looked for a very long time like joy. In the 1990s, children's television in America underwent a transformation so thorough that it reshaped how an entire generation understood entertainment, identity, and the boundary between the adult world and their own. At the center of that transformation was a cable channel with an orange logo and a promise that was radical in its simplicity. Kids were in charge. Nickelodeon did not invent children's programming. What it invented was the feeling that childhood itself was a country and the channel was its government. The slime, the game shows, the sketch comedy, the tweenage ensemble casts, the audience participation, the deliberate messiness, all of it communicated a single message. Adults were ridiculous. Rules were negotiable. And the funniest person in the room was almost certainly under 15. That message was worth an enormous amount of money. By the mid-1990s, Nickelodeon was not merely a channel. It was a brand, a merchandise empire, a cultural vocabulary shared by tens of millions of American households. Its programs did not compete only with other children's television. They competed with the rituals of childhood itself: homework, play dates, dinner table conversation, and they often won. The network's live-action comedies, in particular, became appointment viewing for a demographic that the television industry had long treated as an afterthought. Families gathered around the set, children memorized catchphrases, parents assumed, because the programming was labeled for children, that the environment producing it was as safe as the programming itself appeared to be. That assumption was the foundation on which everything rested. It was also, as later testimony would reveal, the assumption that made this system so difficult to challenge from the inside. And the person most closely associated with that system, the figure who came to embody Nickelodeon's dominance of American child culture across 2 decades, was a former child actor turned writer, producer, and showrunner named Dan Schneider. Schneider's career began in front of the camera. He had appeared in films during the 1980s, including a visible role in a teen comedy, but his lasting power came from what he built behind the scenes. By the mid 1990s, he had positioned himself as one of the most prolific creators in the history of children's television. The credits were staggering in their scope. All That, The Amanda Show, Keenan and Kel, Drake and Josh, Zoe 101, iCarly Victorious, Sam and Cat. His name was not famous in the way his young stars' names were famous. Most viewers under the age of 12 had no idea who produced the shows they watched. They knew Amanda, they knew Drake and Josh, they knew Keenan and Kel. The man who built the stages on which those children performed was invisible to the audience, which is itself a significant detail. The most powerful adult in the room was also the one the children's audience had no reason to think about. Inside the industry, Schneider was understood differently. He found talent, built vehicles around that talent, and delivered ratings. He launched careers that translated from small screen children's comedy into broader entertainment. He made the network money, reliable, repeatable, demographically targeted money, and in return, the network gave him resources, creative authority, and the kind of institutional trust that accumulates over years of commercial success. His production company, Schneider's Bakery, became synonymous with a particular strain of children's comedy. Loud, fast, physically inventive, slightly anarchic, anchored by child performers who seemed more confident and verbally quick than real children had any right to be. The format worked. Show after show, it worked. And because it worked, the system that produced it was allowed to continue with remarkably little external scrutiny. There is something about that arrangement that is worth sitting with for a moment. A single adult operating inside a corporate structure was granted extraordinary creative and professional authority over a rotating cast of children. Those children were not students. They were not volunteers. They were workers, child performers under contract, governed by labor laws that were supposed to protect them, but that could not, by their nature, regulate the subtler dynamics of power, proximity, trust, and access that defined life on a television set. The parents of those children trusted the network. The network trusted the showrunner. The showrunner's authority was validated year after year by ratings and revenue. And the children, whose talent made the entire structure profitable, occupied the lowest rung of institutional power. They could be funny. They could not negotiate. They could perform. They could not question. That was the foundation. It looked from every public angle like opportunity. It looked like the dream that every stage parent whispered about. Your child on television, making people laugh, earning money, building a name. What it also was, what it could not help but be, was a workplace in which children were dependent on adults they had not chosen, inside a hierarchy they could not see. Into that world, in 1996, walked a 10-year-old girl from Thousand Oaks, California, whose comic timing was so immediate, so physically assured, so startlingly adult in its precision, that the adults who saw her recognized something they could use. Her name was Amanda Laura Bynes. She was born on April 3rd, 1986, the youngest of 3 children in a household that had no connection to the entertainment industry. Her father, Rick Bynes, was a dentist with a practice in the suburban sprawl northwest of Los Angeles. Her mother, Lynn Bynes, worked as a dental assistant and office manager, a detail that grounds the family in a specific economic and social world. This was not a Hollywood dynasty. This was not a family with agents in the contacts list and production deals over breakfast. This was a middle-class professional household in Thousand Oaks, a planned community in Ventura County known for good schools, low crime, and a safe distance from the industry that dominated the other side of the hills. The Bynes family entered that industry not through inheritance or connection, but through the oldest pathway in child stardom, a gifted child whose talent was too obvious to ignore. Amanda had taken comedy classes. She had appeared in commercials and a bunch of crunch advertisement that attracted attention. She had the kind of natural ability that instructors notice within minutes. The willingness to be absurd, the instinct for timing, the physical looseness that lets a child fall, stumble, and recover in ways that make audiences gasp and then laugh. She could hold a room, she could improvise, she could deliver a punchline with the confidence of a performer 3 times her age and the openness of a child who had not yet learned to protect herself from scrutiny. She was by every account exceptionally funny. and she was 10 years old. That combination, prodigious talent and extreme youth, is the raw material from which child stardom is built. It is also the raw material from which a particular kind of vulnerability is built. Because talent at 10 does not come with the cognitive architecture to understand what talent at 10 means inside an industry run by adults. Amanda did not audition for all that because she wanted to become a brand. She auditioned because she loved performing. The feel of it, the rush of it, the moment when a character landed and the audience responded. What she entered, however, was not a school play or a community theater production. It was a professional television set with scripts, call times, rehearsal schedules, wardrobe fittings, promotional obligations, and audience expectations that translated directly into advertising revenue. The laughter was real. The applause was real. The joy on her face, captured in hundreds of hours of archival footage, appears to have been real. But the structure around that joy was work, and the adults who profited from that work outnumbered the child who produced it by a ratio that no 10-year-old could have calculated. Amanda joined the cast of all that and was a standout almost immediately. There is something particular about the kind of child performer who does not merely deliver lines, but inhabits characters with a freedom that makes directors lean closer and producers recalculate their plans. Amanda could do sketch comedy with the physical commitment of a seasoned vaudevillian and the imaginative recklessness of a child who had not yet learned to be self-conscious about her body or her choices. She threw herself into characters. She committed to absurdity with a seriousness that made the absurdity funnier. She was versatile, able to shift between broad physical comedy and quieter character work, and she was fast, which mattered on a show that relied on pace and ensemble timing. What that meant, in practical terms, was a childhood rewritten around production schedules. The drive from Thousand Oaks to the Nickelodeon studios was not short. The hours on set were governed by child labor regulations, but the emotional hours, the preparation, the waiting, the performing, the unwinding, the return to a suburban home where nobody else's mother drove them to a television studio, were not subject to any regulation at all. Amanda was surrounded by other children on set, which created a simulacrum of normal social life. But the relationships formed on a production set are not the same as relationships formed on a playground. They are professional relationships conducted by minors, mediated by adults, and terminated when the show is canceled or the contract expires. The friendships may be genuine, the context in which they exist is not. A child on a set learns, without anyone teaching her directly, that her value is conditional on her usefulness, that the warmth of the adults around her is connected to her performance, and that the world she inhabits from Monday to Friday is one that someone else built and someone else controls. By the time the network decided to build a program around her, she was 13 years old. The Amanda Show premiered in 1999, and its premise was its star, Amanda Bynes, playing herself in a gallery of comic characters, anchoring a sketch comedy format that existed because she existed. Her name was in the title. Her face was the brand. The program won her 3 consecutive Kids' Choice Awards for Favorite Television Actress between 2001 and 2003. By 2003, Forbes placed her on its Celebrity 100 list and estimated her net worth at $2 million. She was 17 years old and the most recognizable young performer on American children's television. That fact was celebrated as an achievement. It was also, in the ways that no one was publicly discussing, a burden that no 17-year-old should have been expected to carry alone. There is a particular kind of construction happening in those numbers, and it is essential to see it clearly before the story can continue. A child's gift becomes a family's altered trajectory. A family's altered trajectory becomes a network's proven asset. A network's proven asset becomes an industry's evidence that the system works, that child stardom is safe, that the children are happy, that the parents are present, that the adults in charge are responsible. And somewhere inside that construction, a girl is growing up, not in the way her classmates in Thousand Oaks were growing up, but on the camera, on schedule, under lights, surrounded by adults whose professional futures were connected to her continued willingness to perform. She was a daughter, a youngest child, a funny kid from a dental family. She was also an economic unit. The tension between those two identities, person and product, would define everything that followed. Lynn and Rick Bynes occupy the most delicate position in this narrative because the available public record does not support a simple portrait of either parent. They were not absentee. They were not, by any documented account, indifferent to their daughter's welfare. What they were was something harder to render in a script that demands clear character arcs. Parents of a working child in an industry designed to make parental oversight feel like both a right and an intrusion. A parent on a television set is there because their child is a minor. But a parent on a television set is also there inside someone else's workplace, surrounded by people whose expertise, authority, and professional status can make a mother or father feel like a guest in their own child's professional life. The showrunner knows the script. The director knows the shots. The network executives know the ratings. The parent knows the child, but knowing the child does not automatically translate into understanding the professional system that the child has entered. Lynn's role should be understood through what is documented, not through what is alleged in a working title that cannot be verified. She was Amanda's mother. She was present during the years of Amanda's rise. She was, later, part of the conservatorship that would govern Amanda's finances and personal decisions for nearly 9 years. And she was the person Amanda herself chose to credit, in a 2018 interview with Paper Magazine, with helping her rebuild. Amanda said her parents had helped her get sober and get back on track. She said she was grateful. She said she was embarrassed by the things she had said and done during the years she was using substances, and she apologized for past accusations she had made, describing them as substance-induced and saying she was ashamed. That interview matters enormously because it complicates any attempt to cast Lynn as the villain of this story. Whatever tensions existed, and they clearly did, the daughter, speaking in recovery, named her parents as people who had helped save her life. Rick Bynes' thread runs quieter through the available record. He was a dentist. He was a father. He was part of a household whose youngest child had become, by adolescence, the most economically significant person in the family. That inversion, a child earning more than her parents, carrying professional obligations that exceeded her developmental capacity, occupying a public role that dwarfed her private identity, is one of the most corrosive dynamics in the history of child stardom, and it does not require anyone to be a villain to produce harm. It requires only a system in which the child's economic value outpaces the family's ability to protect the child from the consequences of that value. Rick continued his dental practice. He continued being a father, but the center of gravity in the Bynes household had shifted, and it had shifted toward a child who was still years away from being able to drive a car. Dan Schneider's relationship to Amanda during these years was the relationship of a showrunner to his most valuable performer. He built the creative world she inhabited on screen. He shaped the comedic language she spoke. He determined through casting, scripting, and production decisions the professional environment in which she spent her working hours. After Quiet on Set aired in 2024, Schneider released a video interview in which he said the documentary was difficult to watch. He apologized for some past behaviors. He acknowledged that workplace messages had happened and that they were wrong. He acknowledged inappropriate conduct in writers' rooms he had led. He denied implications connecting him to harm involving young performers. And he said something that would echo through every subsequent discussion of Amanda's story. He said he had supported Amanda's desire for emancipation from her parents when she was younger. That single detail contains more narrative weight than almost anything else in this story. A teenage performer was close enough to a powerful producer that the producer became involved in the most intimate question a minor can face, whether to legally separate from her own parents. Now, whatever Schneider's intentions, supportive, manipulative, protective, self-serving, or some combination that cannot be reduced to a single motive, the fact that such a conversation was happening at all signals a confusion of boundaries so profound that it redefines what was being built on those brightly lit sets. It was not only a television show. It was a world in which a child's most important adult relationships, with her parents, with her employer, with the person who controlled her professional future, had become tangled in ways that no child should have been expected to navigate. But Amanda was not the only child inside that world. Drake Bell entered the Nickelodeon ecosystem as a boy with musical talent and comic ability, and he became one of the network's most recognizable young performers. His trajectory mirrored Amanda's in its public brightness. A child whose gifts were identified early, placed inside a professional structure that amplified those gifts and celebrated for delivering exactly what the system needed. He could act, he could sing, he could carry a program. Drake and Josh, which paired him with Josh Peck, became one of Schneider's most successful productions, running from 2004 to 2007. What the public saw was a confident teenage boy with a guitar and a grin, navigating the comic misadventures of a blended family. What the public did not know, what almost no one outside a small circle knew for 20 years, was that Belle had been harmed as a teenager by a man named Brian Peck. Peck was not a stranger. He was not someone who had gained access through deception alone. He was a dialogue coach who had worked on Nickelodeon programs, including All That and The Amanda Show. He was, in the language of the system, a trusted professional, someone whose presence on set was unremarkable precisely because his role placed him in close, regular, one-on-one contact with child performers. A dialogue coach helps a child learn lines. A dialogue coach works with a child alone. A dialogue coach, in the economy of a television set, occupies a position of intimate pedagogical authority that parents and producer alike tend to regard as benign. That was the opening. Bell later said the mistreatment began when he was 15. He said that Peck had convinced his mother and others around the family that Bell should continue to visit Peck's home for auditions and dialogue coaching, that the arrangement was professional, convenient, and in the child's interest. The logistics of the entertainment industry, the travel between cities, the overnight stays, the assumption that adults working in children's television were safe by definition, had created the conditions in which the mistreatment could happen repeatedly, hidden behind the same trust that made the system function. Peck was arrested in 2003, pleaded no contest to charges connected to a younger person, was sentenced in 2004 to 16 months in prison, and was required to register as a registered offender. The victim's name was sealed. Drake Bell would not be publicly identified as that victim until 2024. For 20 years, he carried a sealed story inside a public life that millions of people thought they understood. There were others, and their number is part of the point. Lori Beth Denberg, an earlier generation performer from All That, would later accuse Schneider of inappropriate behavior during and after her time on the program. Schneider disputed certain claims as exaggerated or false, while acknowledging that he had made mistakes as leader. Her testimony is significant not only for what it alleged, but for when it allegedly occurred. If the pattern began before Amanda's peak years, then the system was already producing harm before the family from Thousand Oaks had even entered the building. Christy Stratton and Jenny Kilgan, writers on The Amanda Show, would tell the documentary that the writer's room was a place of workplace bias, intimidation, and inappropriate conduct. Stratton said working for Schneider felt like being in a harmful relationship. Their accounts add an essential layer because they show that the power dynamics of the system did not only affect the children in front of the camera, they affected the adults behind it. A writer who felt unable to challenge her showrunner's behavior was, in a meaningful sense, trapped by the same structural forces that trapped a child performer. The need for employment, the dependency on a single powerful figure, the fear that speaking up would end a career. Giovanni Samuels, Brian Hearn, Katrina Johnson, Kyle Sullivan, Shane Lyons, former child performers whose names most viewers had forgotten, would appear in the documentary or respond to it, some processing for the first time what their childhoods on those sets had actually looked like when stripped of the Nickelodeon brand and the passage of time. Each of them had been a child in the same system. Each had grown into an adult carrying memories that did not match the official narrative of fun and freedom. Some would later sit for the documentary's 5th episode titled Breaking the Silence, which was added because the response to the first 4 episodes demanded it. They formed a chorus, not of identical experience, but of shared proximity to a world that had shaped them in ways no one had publicly acknowledged until they were well into adulthood. None of these people, not Amanda, not Drake, not Lori Beth, not the writers, not the anonymous chorus of former child performers, were inside a family in the traditional sense. But the network had encouraged them to think of it as one. The Nickelodeon family, the set as a home, the cast as siblings, the producers as mentors. The language of family was used to describe a professional relationship in which children were paid to perform and adults were paid to manage them, and that language did something insidious. It made the boundaries between care and commerce feel unnecessary. If this was a family, then trust was assumed. If this was a family, then the adults were looking out for the children. If this was a family, then a parent who questioned the setup was questioning the family itself. The real families, the Bynes family in Thousand Oaks, Drake Bell's family, the families of every child who performed on those sets existed at the edge of this constructed world. They signed the contracts, they drove the carpools, they sat in the green rooms, they saw the finished programs on television and watched their children become famous. What they could not always see was the full interior of the workplace their children inhabited. The writer's room was closed to parents. The creative decisions were made by producers. The power dynamics between adults and children were invisible to anyone who was not present for every interaction, every conversation, every moment when a child was alone with a trusted professional behind a closed door. The family was taking shape, not one family, but an interlocking system of families, real and constructed. Amanda at the center, talented and young and carrying more professional weight than any child should carry. Lynn and Rick beside her, close enough to sign papers and drive to the set, but not always close enough to see the full machinery their daughter had entered. Schneider above them all, the creative authority whose success validated the system and whose power made him difficult to challenge. Peck moving quietly through the background, trusted and credentialed and later convicted. The other children, Drake, Lori Beth, the ensemble players, the rotating cast across multiple shows, absorbing the culture of a workplace that looked like play but operated like an industry. What did the Bynes household look like during those years? The public record offers no intimate portrait, and to invent one would be to do exactly what this story warns against, imposing a narrative on people whose private lives remain, rightly, their own. But certain structural realities can be named. A family with a child star is a family in which one member's professional life reorganizes everyone else's rhythms. The call times, the commute, the publicity events, the network obligations, the travel, all of these pull the household toward the child's career as surely as gravity pulls toward mass. Siblings live in the shadow of fame that is not theirs. A parent's attention divides between the working child and the children who are not working. The family finances, which once followed the predictable logic of a dental practice, now include a child's earnings that may exceed the father's income. None of this requires bad intentions. It simply requires a system, and the Bynes family was inside one. Amanda's older siblings, she had a brother and a sister, occupied a position that is rarely examined in child star narratives. They were not famous. They were not on camera. They were the family members whose ordinariness threw Amanda's extraordinariness into sharper relief and whose experience of their sister's fame remains entirely private. Their existence matters here only as a reminder that the household Amanda came home to was not a production set. It was a family with its own dynamics, its own tensions, and its own version of normality that was being quietly redefined by the youngest member's professional life and the viewers, millions of them, children themselves sitting in living rooms across America, watching Amanda Bynes make them laugh and feeling without knowing it that the laughter meant everything was fine. The orange logo, the slime, the sketch wigs, the audience cheering, the credits rolling, the child going home, wherever home was, whatever home meant when you were the most famous teenager in the building and the youngest person in the room. The Kids' Choice Awards stage, bright and enormous and deafening with applause. The magazine interviews conducted by adults about a child's feelings toward fame, love, fashion, and the future. The merchandise with her face on it, the fan mail, the recognition in public places. Every one of these details is a thread connecting Amanda to a world that wanted something from her, and every thread was held on the other end by an adult who benefited from her willingness to keep giving it. Everything in those years looked like success. Amanda's name was on a program. Her face was on magazine covers and merchandise. Her family's trajectory had been transformed by a child's talent and an industry's appetite. The network was thriving. The producers were powerful. The viewers were happy. The children were laughing. The parents were proud or hopeful or cautious or some combination of all three. It is impossible to know for certain because the private experience of a family inside that machine was never the part that anyone thought to record. What was recorded was the product. The sketches, the catchphrases, the orange slime, the ratings, the awards. The box office returns when Amanda moved from television into film. The public narrative was simple, and it was told so often and with such conviction that it became the only story most people knew. A funny girl from Thousand Oaks became a star, and the star made everyone happy, but none of that happiness would survive what came next. Because in 2006, Amanda Bynes would look at herself on a cinema screen and feel something that had nothing to do with laughter. And the question that the system had never asked, what was all of this doing to the girl on the inside, would begin at last to answer itself. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. The films came quickly, and they came wrapped in the same brightness that had defined everything Amanda touched. She was 15 when she filmed Big Fat Liar alongside Frankie Muniz, a broad family comedy built on a premise tailor-made for a child star, with physical comedy instincts, a teenager and her friend scheme to expose a dishonest Hollywood producer. The film was not intended to be a cultural landmark. It was intended to be profitable and entertaining, and it was both, earning enough at the box office to confirm what the network had already suspected. Amanda Bynes could translate from the small screen to the big one. She was bankable. That word, bankable, is the industry's highest compliment and its most revealing confession. It means that a person's name attached to a project will make money. It means that the person is no longer just a performer, but an asset, a financial instrument measured in opening weekend returns and projected revenue. Amanda was 15 years old and bankable. What a Girl Wants followed in 2003, a romantic comedy in which Amanda played an American teenager who travels to England to find the father she has never met, a scenario that, in retrospect, carries an uncomfortable echo of the search for adult stability that would define Amanda's later life. The film was light, commercial, and successful enough to solidify her position as a leading actress in the teen comedy genre. By 2006 came She's the Man, loosely adapted from Shakespeare, in which she disguised herself as her twin brother to play on a boys' football team. Sydney White followed in 2007, a modern retelling of Snow White set on a college campus. And then, in the same year, Hairspray, the film that Amanda would later describe as the peak of her professional happiness. Hairspray was different from the other projects. It was a major studio musical with a budget that reflected its ambitions, a cast that included John Travolta, Michelle Pfeiffer, Queen Latifah, and Zac Efron, and a production scale that placed Amanda inside a world of choreography, ensemble work, and the controlled chaos of a big musical number. She was 21 years old and she was working alongside performers who had been famous for decades. The experience, by her own later account, was exhilarating, not because of the fame it brought, but because of the collaborative energy on set, the feeling of being part of something larger than herself, the sheer physical joy of performing in musical sequences that required her whole body and her whole attention. It was, she told Paper Magazine in 2018, the most amazing experience she had ever had on a set. That detail deserves to be held for a moment because it is not the testimony of a person who hated her career. It is the testimony of a person who, at her peak, experienced genuine happiness inside the work, and whose later suffering was therefore not a simple story of a child who was forced into something she did not want. It was the more complicated story of a person whose gift gave her real pleasure, and whose industry took that pleasure and surrounded it with pressures that the pleasure could not survive. And then Easy A in 2010, a sharp teen comedy that became a breakout vehicle for Emma Stone, but featured Amanda in a supporting role that demonstrated she could work in a different register, less broad, more grounded, still funny. The trajectory, viewed from the outside, was immaculate. A child who had been the funniest kid on a sketch show had become a young woman who could carry a studio comedy, hold her own beside Hollywood veterans, and open a film and name recognition alone. She had accomplished by 24 what most actors spend a lifetime chasing. The cost of that accomplishment was invisible. It was being paid in a currency the public could not see. The Bynes family during these years occupied a position that is familiar in the biographies of child stars, but rarely examined with the specificity it deserves. Amanda was earning adult money. She was making adult decisions about her career, which roles to take, which scripts to read, which publicity to do. She was working alongside adult actors, adult directors, and adult producers who treated her, professionally, as a peer. But she was still a teenager, and then a young woman in her early 20s. And the developmental gap between professional capacity and emotional maturity is not something that disappears because a child is talented. Lynn and Rick were present. The available record does not detail the specific contours of their parental involvement during the film years, whether they accompanied Amanda to sets, how they managed her finances, what conversations happened at the kitchen table in Thousand Oaks about contracts and public image, and the particular dangers of growing up famous in an industry that trades on youth. What is clear is that the family's center of gravity had shifted definitively. Amanda was no longer just the youngest child. She was the reason the family's financial and social circumstances had changed. And that shift, invisible to the public, unacknowledged in the press coverage, unremarked upon in the cheerful promotional interviews, was reshaping the internal architecture of the household in ways that only the people inside it could have fully understood. The public image during these years was uncomplicated and appealing. Amanda was the girl next door who happened to be famous. She was funny and approachable and apparently unaffected by the machinery of celebrity. She did not, in the early and mid 2000s, attract the kind of tabloid attention that consumed other young female celebrities of her generation. The paparazzi culture of that era, which reached a peak of invasiveness around 2007, feeding a gossip magazine industry that generated revenue from photographs of young women in states of distress, intoxication, or vulnerability, largely passed Amanda by at first. Other young women in Hollywood were being photographed stumbling out of nightclubs, their faces on the weekly magazine covers with headlines that oscillated between concern and cruelty. The entertainment press had discovered that a young female celebrity in crisis was worth more in clicks and newsstand sales than a young female celebrity in control. The incentive structure was perverse. The worse a young woman's life became, the more valuable her image became to the people who photographed and published it. Amanda, during this period, was not part of that cycle. She worked, she promoted her films, she attended premieres and award shows. She gave interviews that were professional and unrevealing, offering the kind of warm, careful public persona that a young woman who had been famous since childhood learns to maintain as naturally as breathing. She seemed stable, she seemed grounded. She seemed, to the extent that the public could judge from the curated surface of a celebrity's public life, like the one who had escaped, the child star who had made it through without being consumed. That impression was not entirely wrong. It was simply incomplete. Because beneath the surface of a career that looked like unbroken success, something had already begun to change. And the very fact that Amanda had avoided tabloid scrutiny during the worst years of that culture meant that when her own crisis eventually became visible, the public had no framework for understanding it. She had been the safe one. She had been the normal one. When normality collapsed, the collapse felt more disorienting, not because it was worse than what had happened to other young women, but because the audience had believed with the particular conviction that comes from watching someone grow up on screen that Amanda Bynes was immune. The year was 2006. Amanda was 20 years old. She's the Man was released in March, a teen comedy loosely based on Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, in which Amanda disguised herself as her twin brother to play on a boys' football team. The premise required her to spend significant portions of the film dressed as a boy, her features altered by makeup and prosthetics, her body language deliberately masculinized. The film was a commercial success and became a beloved entry in the teen comedy genre. Audiences found it charming and funny. Critics were generally kind. The performance was praised as committed and physically daring. Amanda watched it and fell apart. She later told Paper Magazine that seeing herself on screen in She's the Man had sent her into a deep depression lasting 4 to 6 months. She said she could not bear how she looked when disguised as a boy. The image she saw on the screen, the image that audiences found hilarious and endearing, was for her a source of profound distress. There is something about that detail that restructures the entire narrative of Amanda Bynes' career because it transforms a beloved comedy into a private wound. The audience was laughing. The performer was looking at herself and finding the reflection unbearable. The distance between those two experiences, the public joy and the private horror, is the crack that the rest of this story will widen until it swallows everything. It is worth being precise about what this was and what it was not. Amanda did not describe a bad day on set. She did not describe a disagreement with a director or a disappointing performance. She described a reaction to her own image that was visceral, sustained, and debilitating, a response consistent with body dysmorphia, though no formal diagnosis has been publicly confirmed for this period. She was a young woman whose professional life had been defined, since childhood, by her physical presence on camera. Her face had been her livelihood. Her body had been her instrument, and now at 20, she was watching that body on a cinema screen and experiencing a revulsion so intense that it consumed months of her life. 4 to 6 months. That is not a bad week. That is not a rough patch. That is a depression that outlasted the film's entire theatrical run. A depression that was happening inside a person who was expected, by contract and by custom, to promote the very film that had caused it. The public knew none of this. The press coverage of She's the Man was light and positive. The promotional interviews were cheerful. Amanda smiled for the cameras and said the expected things about how fun the film had been, how much she had enjoyed the challenge of playing a boy, how liberating it was to commit so fully to a physical transformation. The facade held. It held because Amanda was good at the facade. She had, after all, been trained in it since she was 10, had spent half her life presenting a version of herself to cameras and interviewers that was optimized for public consumption, and because no one in the machinery around her had any reason to look beneath it. The film made money. The career continued. The next project was already in development. There was no space inside the momentum of a successful Hollywood career for a young woman to say that she had looked at herself and felt destroyed. The machinery does not accommodate that kind of honesty. It accommodates schedules, deliverables, and the next opening weekend. The second crack was chemical, and it grew from the same root as the first. Amanda later told Paper that she had begun misusing a prescribed stimulant after reading about it being used as weight loss aid. The substance, a stimulant prescribed for attention deficit disorders, had acquired a secondary reputation in certain circles as a tool for staying thin, a weight loss shortcut, as Amanda described it. She began taking it recreationally. The timeline is not precisely fixed in public interviews, but the practice appears to have escalated through the late 2000s, coinciding with the period when body image distress was already reshaping her relationship to her own appearance. This is not a moral failure bit. It is not the moment where the story assigns blame to a young woman for making a bad choice. It is the moment where the structural pressures of a life spent on camera, the scrutiny, the body commentary, the industry's relentless preference for thinness, the internalized belief that appearance is professional value converted into a specific, predictable, and devastating form of self-medication. Amanda did not start using a prescribed stimulant because she lacked willpower. She started using it because she lived inside a system that had taught her since childhood that how she looked on screen was the most important thing about her, and the lesson had taken root so deeply that she was willing to alter her brain chemistry to control the image. The body that had made her famous had become the body she could not stand to see. By 2010, the cracks had become a fracture. Amanda was cast in Hall Pass, a Farrelly Brothers comedy starring Owen Wilson and Jason Sudeikis. It should have been a step forward, an adult comedy role, a departure from the teen film bracket, proof that she could evolve as a performer. Instead, it became the moment when the machinery broke down visibly enough that it could no longer be ignored. Amanda later described what happened in the trailer during filming. She said she was chewing prescribed stimulant tablets, not swallowing them, chewing them, grinding the medication between her teeth in a gesture that carries the desperation of someone trying to make a substance work faster, harder, more completely, in an attempt to manage her anxiety and her appearance simultaneously. She said she was unable to focus on her lines, that the words on the page would not stay in her head, that the concentration required to do what she had been doing effortlessly since childhood was suddenly beyond her reach. She said she looked at her arm on the monitor and disliked what she saw. Not a fleeting irritation, but a focused, consuming dissatisfaction with a single body part displayed on a screen. She said she left the production, acknowledging that it was unprofessional while disputing reports that she had been fired. The details are small and specific and devastating in their precision. The trailer, the tablets ground between teeth, the arm on a monitor, the inability to focus, the departure from a set for the last time. This was not a tabloid meltdown. This was not a paparazzi photograph of a young woman behaving erratically in public. This was a young woman sitting alone in a confined space inside a working film set, destroying medication with her molars, staring at a screen that showed her an image of herself she could not tolerate, and then walking away from a career that had defined her entire conscious life. She had been performing since she was 7, working professionally since she was 10, carrying a network since she was 13. She was 24 years old and she could not do it anymore. The working child who always delivered, who had never missed a cue, never lost her timing, never failed to be the funniest person in the room, had become an adult performer who could no longer inhabit the machine that had built her. The transition happened not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small private collapses. The depression after She's the Man, the prescribed stimulant, the body scrutiny, the growing distance between the public Amanda and the private one. Each collapse was invisible to the public. Each was processed alone, or nearly alone, inside the narrow confines of a life that had been structured since childhood around performance and approval. The system did not have a mechanism for processing this kind of failure because the system was not designed to see its performers as people who could break. It was designed to see them as assets, and a depreciating asset is not a person in crisis. It is a scheduling problem, it is a casting replacement. It is a conversation between agents and studio executives about liability and insurance, and whether the next project should proceed with a different name above the title. What was the Bynes family experiencing during this period? The question is easier to ask than to answer, because the private dynamics of a household under this kind of pressure are exactly that, private. What can be said is that the family was navigating a situation for which no parenting manual existed. Their daughter was not a rebellious teenager sneaking out of the house. She was a professional performer in her early 20s, whose career was collapsing under the weight of mental health struggles that were compounded by the very industry that had given the family its transformed circumstances. Did Lynn see the A prescribed stimulant? Did Rick understand the body dysmorphia? Did either parent have the vocabulary or the framework to distinguish between ordinary young adult turbulence and the specific industry inflicted damage that was consuming their daughter? These are not accusatory questions. They are the questions that haunt every family whose child has been inside a system that the family did not build and could not fully see. And here the emancipation detail returns, heavier now than when it was first introduced. Dan Schneider later said, after the documentary aired, that he had supported Amanda's desire for emancipation from her parents when she was younger. That statement places a producer, the most powerful professional adult in Amanda's working life, inside the most intimate family question imaginable. Whether Schneider's support was well intentioned, whether it was self serving, whether it was some tangled combination of both, the fact remains a teenage girl was caught between parents who legally controlled her life and a producer whose career benefited from her talent. The producer's involvement in the emancipation conversation did not resolve that tension. It deepened it because it introduced a third gravitational pull into a family system that was already straining under the weight of fame, money, and the impossible task of protecting a child who was also a professional commodity. Amanda did not, in the end, seek emancipation. She remained legally under her parents' authority. But the fact that the conversation happened, the fact that it happened within the orbit of a showrunner who had built his empire on the talents of children, reveals something about the boundaries of the world she inhabited. The lines between family and industry, between parental authority and professional power, between protection and control, had become so blurred that a child's relationship with her own parents could be contested by someone whose primary connection to her was commercial. That is not an accusation against any individual. It is a description of a system, and the system was not built to protect the child at its center. The early consequences of the fracture unfolded quietly at first. Amanda stepped back from acting. She did not announce a retirement. She did not hold a press conference or issue a statement through a publicist. She simply stopped appearing in new projects, and the industry, which had rewarded her talent for 14 years, absorbed her absence with the indifference of a system that has no mechanism for grief. There were no public tributes, no retrospective celebrations, no industry acknowledgement that a young woman who had been one of its most reliable performers since childhood was disappearing from its ranks at 24. A career that had begun when she was 10 years old, a career that had generated millions of dollars in revenue for a network, a production company, film studios, agents, managers, publicists, and the entire infrastructure of commercial entertainment ended not with a finale but with a vacancy. The next face was already being found. The next talent was already being developed. The machine does not pause, it replaces. Amanda later described the period after acting as one defined by a particular kind of emptiness. She told Paper Magazine that she had been working her whole life, and then suddenly she was doing nothing. She said she had no purpose. There is a brutality in those words that is easy to miss if you have not spent a childhood inside a professional structure. A person who has worked since the age of 10 does not experience unemployment the way an adult who chose a career at 22 does. For Amanda, work was not something she did. It was the organizing principle of her identity, the thing that told her who she was, that gave her days structure, that surrounded her with people whose attention and approval she had learned to depend on. When the work stopped, the scaffolding collapsed. She was left with the question that every former child star eventually faces and that no amount of money or fame can answer. Who am I when I am not performing? The answer, for Amanda, involved substances, instability, and a public unraveling that the tabloid press would document with the same voyeuristic precision it had applied to every other young woman in crisis. The details of those years, the erratic social media posts, the legal incidents, the public behavior that alarmed friends and strangers alike belong to the next phase of this story. But the fact that they happened must be named here, because they cast a backward shadow over everything that came before. Every sketch Amanda performed at 10, every film she carried at 15, every award she accepted at 17, all of it now existed inside a different frame. The success was real. The talent was real. The joy, where it had existed, was real. But the cost was also real. And the cost was being paid by a person who had started accumulating the debt before she was old enough to understand that the debt existed. The Bynes family was now navigating territory that no family should have to navigate alone, and that this particular family had not been equipped to navigate by anything in their prior experience. A dentist and a dental assistant from Thousand Oaks were watching their youngest child, the one whose talent had transformed the family's circumstances, come apart in ways that were simultaneously private and increasingly public. The tools available to them were the tools available to any parents of a troubled young adult: love, concern, presence, and the hope that the person they knew was still inside the person they were watching struggle. What they did not have, what no parent of a child star has, unless they possess extraordinary prescience and equally extraordinary resources, was a framework for understanding that their daughter's crisis was not purely personal. It was the predictable outcome of a system that used children, rewarded adults, and left the families in between to manage the consequences with nothing but good intentions. Meanwhile, in the wider Nickelodeon ecosystem, the adults who had built the machine were still operating it. Schneider's programs continued to air. New child stars were being cast in new shows. iCarly had launched in 2007, Victorious in 2010, both produced by Schneider's Bakery, both following the established formula of young performers, fast comedy, and the invisible authority of a showrunner whose creative control was absolute. The ratings remained strong. The brand remained powerful. The new generation of Nickelodeon children was entering the same system that Amanda and Drake had inhabited, learning the same lessons about trust, performance, and the conditional warmth of a professional environment that called itself a family. Brian Peck had been convicted and sentenced, but the sealed nature of the case meant that his crime existed in a kind of institutional silence, known to those who had been directly involved, invisible to the public, invisible to the parents of current child performers, and invisible to the millions of viewers who continued to watch Nickelodeon programming with the assumption that the environment producing it was safe. The system had processed a convicted registered offender not through reform or public accountability, but through sealed records and the passage of time. The children on the new shows did not know, their parents did not know, the viewers did not know. And the person most directly harmed, Drake Bell, was carrying a sealed story that the system's very structure ensured he could not tell. Drake was 24 in 2010, the same age Amanda was. He had spent his career in the same ecosystem, on sets governed by the same power dynamics, inside a professional world that had granted trusted adult access to a man who used that access to commit a crime against a child. His public persona remained the charming, guitar-playing young man the audience remembered from Drake and Josh. His private reality was the reality of a survivor of childhood harm whose offender had been convicted, but whose own name was sealed inside the very legal system that was supposed to protect him. The seal protected his privacy. It also ensured his silence. And the silence meant that the system that had produced his mistreatment continued to operate without the accountability that his story, told publicly, might have demanded. Lori Beth Denberg was carrying a story she had not yet told publicly. The writers who had worked under Schneider were carrying stories that had no obvious venue. And Amanda Bynes, the brightest star the system had ever produced, was disappearing from public life in a way that should have prompted every adult who had profited from her talent to ask what had gone wrong. Almost no one asked. The industry does not ask that question, because asking it would require examining the structure that the industry depends on. The tabloids did not ask it because the tabloids profit from the spectacle of collapse, not from the analysis of its causes. The public did not ask it because the public had been trained by decades of celebrity culture to interpret a young woman's crisis as a personal failing rather than a systemic outcome. The only people who might have asked, the people closest to Amanda, the people who had watched her grow up on camera and in their home, were the people least equipped to see the full picture. Lynn and Rick Bynes knew their daughter. They did not necessarily know the full interior of the world that had made her famous. And by 2010, the daughter they knew was struggling with something that no amount of parental love by itself could fix. The family from Thousand Oaks had entered a machine. The machine had used their daughter's talent to build an empire. And now the machine was moving on, and the daughter was left with the inheritance that the empire had given her. Not money, not fame, not the laughter of millions, but something quieter and more durable and far more difficult to live with. But the full reckoning was still years away. Because the children who had been inside the machine, not just Amanda, but Drake and Lori Beth, and the ensemble chorus of former performers whose names the public had forgotten, were growing up. And growing up, for people who had spent their childhoods inside a system that no one had examined, meant eventually finding the language for what had happened to them. That language would take until 2024 to arrive. When it did, it would not come from Amanda. It would come from a documentary, a camera, and the adults that the children had become. And it would change the meaning of every laugh track, every orange logo, and every brightly lit set that the network had ever built. The years between 2010 and 2014 were the years in which the private collapse became public. Amanda Bynes had left the film industry quietly, but her absence from screens did not translate into absence from public attention. Instead, it translated into a different kind of visibility, the kind that feeds on disorder, that photographs a person at their lowest and distributes the image to millions, that converts private suffering into the currency of entertainment gossip. The tabloid press, which had largely ignored Amanda during her stable years, now discovered that an unstable Amanda was worth considerably more. The economics were simple and brutal. A photograph of Amanda Bynes looking composed at a premiere was worth almost nothing. A photograph of Amanda Bynes looking disoriented on a street was worth thousands of dollars. The incentive pointed in one direction. The cameras followed. The incidents accumulated with a rhythm that in retrospect reads like a clinical progression. There were driving-related arrests, a hit-and-run allegation, a charge of driving under the influence, a suspended license. There were erratic public appearances that generated photographs and commentary. There were social media posts that alarmed friends, family, and strangers, posts that oscillated between grandiosity and distress, that sometimes targeted other public figures with unprovoked hostility, that sometimes expressed desires and grievances in language that did not sound like the person the public remembered. She posted about her appearance. She posted about other celebrities. She posted things that were deleted and then reposted in altered form. The Amanda who had been composed and funny and professionally reliable at 13 was, by 27, a person whose public behavior was being cataloged by gossip websites with the dispassionate thoroughness of a clinical record. Each incident was reported. Each photograph was published. Each social media post was screenshotted, circulated, and discussed by people who had no relationship to Amanda Bynes except the one they had constructed from watching her on television as children. They felt they knew her. They did not know her. They knew the character. The person behind the character was disintegrating in ways that the character had never been designed to accommodate. In 2012, Amanda was charged with 2 counts of hit and run. In 2013, she was arrested and charged with reckless endangerment, tampering with evidence, and controlled substance possession after an incident in her New York apartment. The details of that arrest, the allegation that she had thrown a glass object from a window of her apartment, became tabloid fodder for weeks. She was taken to a hospital. She was evaluated. The trajectory was no longer deniable, not to the public and not to her family. There is something about this period that resists simple narration, because to narrate it in detail risks doing exactly what the tabloid press did, turning a person's crisis into content. What can be said, with care, is that Amanda was struggling with substance misuse and mental health difficulties that were compounded by the very public platform she had been given as a child. She had millions of social media followers who watched her in real time, who commented on her posts, who shared her images, who debated her mental state with the casual authority of strangers who had decided that a person's pain was a public resource. She had a tabloid press that profited from her distress. She had a public that oscillated between concern and cruelty, between wanting to help and wanting to watch, between the impulse to look away and the inability to stop looking. And she had a family, Lynn and Rick Bynes, her brother and sister, who were watching their daughter, their sister, come apart in a way that was simultaneously intimate and broadcast to the world. The conservatorship was established in 2013. A judge in Ventura County granted Lynn Bynes temporary conservatorship over Amanda's personal and financial affairs, a legal arrangement that placed a woman who had been earning her own money since childhood under the decision-making authority of her mother. The conservatorship would be extended and modified over the years that followed, and it would ultimately last nearly 9 years, a span of time that covered most of Amanda's late 20s and all of her early 30s. It would govern her finances, her living arrangements, her medical treatment, and the fundamental architecture of her daily autonomy. It was, by its nature, a declaration that Amanda could not, at that time, manage her own life. And it was also, by its nature, a transfer of power from a daughter to a mother inside a relationship that had already been reshaped, strained, and tested by 17 years of child stardom, industry pressure, public scrutiny, and the impossible dynamics of a family whose youngest member was simultaneously its most famous, its most vulnerable, and its most valuable. The word conservatorship carries a particular weight in American culture, a weight that would be amplified in subsequent years by other high profile cases that brought questions of parental authority, financial control, and adult autonomy into national conversation. It is not, in principle, a punitive measure. It is designed to protect people who are unable, temporarily or permanently, to protect themselves, a legal acknowledgement that some adults require, the kind of guardian oversight that most people associate with childhood. But it is also an extraordinary exercise of authority over an adult's autonomy, and it places the conservator, in this case a parent, in a position of power that replicates, in legal form, the power dynamic that existed when the conservatee was a child. For a woman who had been working since she was 10, whose professional life had been governed by adults since before she could drive, whose career had been shaped by a producer she could not challenge and sustained by a network she could not negotiate with, the conservatorship represented a particular kind of return, a return to a state of dependence on parental authority, a return to a condition in which someone else made the decisions, a return to the fundamental asymmetry that had characterized her entire life inside the entertainment industry. Whether the conservatorship was necessary, whether Amanda's crisis had reached a point where her family had no other responsible option, is not a question this narrative can answer with certainty. What is documented is that Amanda was in crisis, that her family sought legal authority to help her, that the courts granted it, and that the arrangement persisted for nearly a decade. What is also documented, and what complicates any attempt to cast the conservatorship as purely oppressive, is that Amanda, years later, spoke about it and about her parents with gratitude rather than resentment. The Paper Magazine interview was published in November of 2018, and it is one of the most important documents in this entire story. Amanda was 32 years old. She was on the cover. The headline read, "Break the Internet." The photographs showed a woman who looked calm, composed, and markedly different from the person the tabloids had documented 5 years earlier. And the words inside, Amanda's own words, in her own voice, at length, told a story that the public had never heard in this form. She said she had been sober for almost 4 years. She said her parents had helped her get back on track. She said she was embarrassed by what she had said and done while using substances. She apologized publicly for past accusations she had made against her father on social media, accusations that had been painful in public and that she now described as substance-fueled and untrue. She said she was ashamed. She said she was sorry. She described starting substances at 16, the escalation to a prescribed stimulant, the experiments with other substances. She described the body dysmorphia that had followed She's the Man, the depression, the misuse of a prescribed stimulant that had been at its root an attempt to control her appearance. She described the emptiness that followed the end of her acting career, that she had been working her whole life and then suddenly was doing nothing, and that the absence of purpose had been unbearable. She said she had enrolled at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising in Los Angeles and was pursuing a degree. She said she wanted to work in fashion. She said she was grateful for her family. She said she wanted to come back, not to acting, not to the industry that had consumed her childhood, but to some form of public life, on her own terms, as the person she was now rather than the character she had been. The interview is remarkable not for what it reveals about the entertainment industry. Amanda does not, in that conversation, name Schneider, accuse Nickelodeon, or describe specific workplace harms, but for what it reveals about the cost of being a child inside a system designed for adults. Every element of her crisis, the body dysmorphia, the substance misuse, the loss of identity after the work stopped, the public behavior, the conservatorship, the family strain, traces a direct line back to a childhood spent performing for an industry that measured her value in ratings and revenue. The line is not speculative. It is visible in her own words. She was working her whole life. Then she was doing nothing. The industry gave her a purpose, and then, when her usefulness diminished, took that purpose away without providing anything to replace it. The substances filled the void. The public behavior was the substances made visible. The conservatorship was the family's attempt to catch a daughter who had been falling, in one way or another, since she was 20 years old. But Amanda's story was only one thread in a much larger unraveling that was, by 2018, beginning to accelerate. In March of 2018, Nickelodeon announced that it and Schneider's bakery had mutually agreed not to extend their production deal. The language was corporate and measured, a mutual decision, an amicable parting, a statement that thanked Schneider for his contributions to the network's success. But the timing was not lost on industry observers. The announcement came during a period when allegations of misconduct in the entertainment industry were being taken more seriously than at any point in modern memory. Reports of complaints about Schneider's behavior had been surfacing for years in trade publications and on social media. References to a difficult workplace, to inappropriate conduct, to a management style that former colleagues described in terms that ranged from demanding to harmful. None of these reports had, at that point, coalesced into the kind of formal, on the record testimony that would later give them institutional weight. But the accumulation was sufficient to create an atmosphere of scrutiny, and the network that had given Schneider creative authority over children's programming for more than 2 decades was, quietly and without public explanation, ending the relationship. The departure was significant not only for what it signaled, but for what it did not provide. There was no public accounting, there was no investigation, or if there was, its findings were not shared with the public. There was no statement from the children, now adults, who had worked under Schneider's authority. There was no mechanism for the people who had experienced the workplace Schneider had created to register their experiences in a way that might have informed the public or protected future child performers. The network processed the end of its most important creative partnership the way institutions typically process uncomfortable separations, through the language of mutual agreement, through the absence of specificity, through the implied hope that silence would substitute for accountability. Schneider was out. The questions about what he had built remained unanswered. What Schneider's departure meant, in practical terms, was that the most powerful individual in the children's television ecosystem had been removed from the structure without a public reckoning. The children who had worked under his authority were now adults, scattered across different lives, carrying different versions of the same institutional memory. The allegations that would later form the basis of Quiet on Set were, in 2018, still fragmented, known to individual people who had experienced or witnessed specific incidents, but not yet assembled into the coherent narrative that a documentary would eventually provide. Former writers knew what the writer's room had been like. Former child performers knew what the sets had been like. Drake Bell knew what Brian Peck had done to him. But none of these people had been brought together, and none of them had been given a public forum in which to speak. The stories existed in isolation, in private conversations, in therapy sessions, in the quiet inventory that a person conducts late at night when they try to make sense of a childhood that no longer matches the story they were told about it. The wider culture was shifting in ways that would eventually make that forum possible. The conversation about power, mistreatment, and institutional complicity that had begun in other industries, in film and journalism and corporate life, was slowly reaching children's entertainment. Other former child stars were beginning to speak. Jeanette McCurdy, who had starred in Schneider, produced programs iCarly and Sam and Cat, was working on a memoir that would be published in 2022 under the title I'm Glad My Mom Died. McCurdy's book was not primarily about Schneider. It was about her mother, about the specific cruelty of a parent who used a child's career as an instrument of control and financial dependency. But its existence in the cultural conversation was significant because it gave audiences a vocabulary for understanding what child stardom could do to a person. It named the mechanisms, the pressure, the body scrutiny, the loss of autonomy, the parent whose love was inseparable from the parent's need. McCurdy's story was not Amanda's story, but it existed in the same ecosystem, produced by the same institutional structures, and it primed a public that had been trained to see child stars as lucky to begin seeing them as vulnerable. The paths were diverging now, clearly, visibly, and in ways that would not converge again until 2024. Amanda, in 2018 and the years that followed, was attempting to rebuild a life outside the entertainment industry. She had graduated from FIDM in 2019 with a degree in merchandise product development. She was sober. She was living in a structured environment. She was, by her own account and by the accounts of people close to her, doing the work of recovery, not the cinematic version of recovery, with its dramatic turning points and triumphant montages, but the actual work, which is daily and unglamorous and consists largely of choosing again and again not to return to the thing that was destroying you. Her conservatorship remained in place. Her parents remained her legal guardians. The public mostly left her alone, which was perhaps the kindest thing the public had ever done for Amanda Bynes. Drake Bell was living a more visibly troubled life, though the source of his trouble remained hidden beneath the surface the public could see. His trajectory after Nickelodeon included music. He had always been a musician, and the guitar-playing charm that had defined his on-screen persona translated into a recording career and acting work of diminishing profile. He had a following in Latin America, where Drake and Josh had been enormously popular, and he toured there with some regularity. But his public life was also marked by legal difficulties and personal struggles that the public processed without the context of what had been done to him as a child. He was arrested and charged in 2021 with charges connected to a younger person in Ohio, to which he pleaded guilty. The charges were unrelated to the mistreatment he had suffered, but the trajectory, a child survivor of harm whose later life included its own legal entanglements, is a pattern that research into mistreatment and its after effects has documented with painful consistency. Trauma does not produce neat outcomes, it produces complications. It produces people whose later behavior is shaped by earlier experiences in ways that are not always visible and not always sympathetic. The man that audiences still associated with the charming teenage character he had played on Drake and Josh was carrying a burden that nobody who watched those reruns could see. He had been harmed by a trusted adult inside the very system that had made him famous, and the legal resolution of that mistreatment had sealed his identity as a victim, protecting his privacy at the cost of ensuring that the public story of his life was incomplete. Every interview he gave, every public appearance he made, every casual reference to his Nickelodeon years existed inside a gap between what the public knew and what Bell knew. That gap was 20 years wide, it shaped everything, and it was about to close. Dan Schneider, after leaving Nickelodeon, existed in a kind of professional limbo that was itself a product of the system's refusal to reckon openly with what had happened under his watch. He was no longer producing children's television. He had not been publicly accused in a formal on-the-record forum that demanded a response. The trade publication reports and social media discussions about his behavior existed in the gray space between allegation and evidence, between rumor and testimony, between the kind of information that circulates within an industry and the kind that reaches the public with enough weight to demand accountability. His legacy was still, in 2018 and 2019, largely defined by the shows he had created rather than by the questions about how those shows had been made. The credits were still impressive. The ratings were still in the record books. The children he had helped make famous were still recognizable names. The empire he had built remained standing, even if the architect had been quietly removed from the building. Lori Beth Denberg was living privately. She had not yet made her accusations public. The experience she would later describe, Schneider engaging in inappropriate behavior during and after her time on All That, behavior that she characterized as inappropriate, was, in 2018, still contained within the boundaries of her private life. She was an adult in her late 30s, a former child performer who had been famous at 14 and whose fame had faded in the way that most child fame fades. Gradually, unceremoniously, and without the kind of public farewell that acknowledges the strangeness of having been known by millions before you were old enough to vote. Christy Stratton and Jenny Kilgan were living the lives of people whose professional experiences had left scars that the industry had never acknowledged. The writer's room they had described, the one characterized by workplace bias, intimidation, and inappropriate conduct, was a room that no longer existed except in their memories and eventually in their willingness to describe it on camera. Their testimony would not reach the public until the documentary provided them with a platform, but the experiences themselves had been carried for years, processed in private, and endured without the validation that public acknowledgement eventually provides. The ensemble chorus of former child performers, Giovanni Samuels, Brian Hearn, Katrina Johnson, Kyle Sullivan, Shane Lyons, were living the varied and largely undocumented lives of adults whose childhood fame had been modest enough to fade, but significant enough to have left marks that only they could see. Each of them carried a version of the Nickelodeon story that the public did not know. Each of them was, in the years before the documentary, a private archive of experience waiting for someone to ask the right questions. And Jeanette McCurdy was writing. Her memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died, would not be published until 2022, but the work of processing a childhood spent inside the Schneider production machine, and more centrally, a childhood spent under the control of a mother whose love was inseparable from exploitation, was already underway. McCurdy's book was not primarily about Schneider or Nickelodeon. It was about her mother, about the specific cruelty of a parent who starved her daughter, who controlled her daughter's body and career and emotional life with a meticulousness that left almost no space for the daughter to exist as a separate person. But the institutional context was Nickelodeon, and the professional context was Schneider's productions, and the book's eventual publication would add another voice to a chorus that was, by the early 2020s, becoming impossible to ignore. McCurdy's story was not Amanda's story. The mothers were different. The specific harms were different. But the ecosystem was the same, and the fundamental question was the same. What happens to children when the adults around them, parents, producers, institutions, prioritize their own needs over the child's safety? The Bynes family was intact but altered in ways that no outside observer could fully measure. Lynn was still Amanda's conservator, the person who signed off on financial decisions, who had legal authority over arrangements that affected her daughter's daily life. Rick was still Amanda's father, still the dentist from Thousand Oaks, still the man whose household had been reshaped by a daughter's fame and then by a daughter's crisis. The family dynamics that had been tested by Amanda's childhood career, strained by her adolescent proximity to powerful industry adults, fractured by her public unraveling, and legally formalized by the conservatorship, were now in a holding pattern. A family caring for an adult daughter who was recovering, who was rebuilding, and who remained, in the eyes of the law, unable to govern her own affairs. There is something about the duration of the conservatorship that demands attention. Nearly 9 years. Amanda was 27 when it began and would be 36 when it ended. Those years spanned the entirety of what developmental psychology would call young adulthood, the period when most people establish independent lives, build careers, form partnerships, make financial decisions, experience the consequences of their choices, and develop the autonomous identity that distinguishes an adult from a dependent child. Amanda spent those years under her mother's legal authority. Whether that authority was exercised with kindness or rigidity, with sensitivity or control, with the intention to heal or the instinct to manage, these are questions the public record cannot fully answer. What can be said is that the conservatorship kept Amanda safe during a period when she could not keep herself safe, and that it also kept her in a position of dependence that echoed, in its fundamental structure, the dependence that had characterized her entire childhood career. She had gone from being a child whose professional life was governed by adults to being an adult whose personal life was governed by a parent. The symmetry is not accusatory, it is simply visible, and it asks a question that this story cannot avoid. At what point does protection become a continuation of the very dynamic that caused the harm? Amanda's conservatorship would end in March of 2022, when a judge terminated the arrangement and restored Amanda's control over her finances and personal decisions. Her parents supported the termination. That detail matters, because it suggests that the conservatorship was not, in the Bynes family's understanding, a permanent assertion of parental authority, but a temporary measure that could be lifted when the person at its center had recovered sufficiently to resume her own governance. Amanda was 35 years old. She had been under some form of adult authority, professional, parental, or legal, for 25 of those years. The question of what it meant to be free, for a person whose entire life had been structured by other people's decisions, was one that no legal document could answer. But in 2018, the conservatorship's end was still 4 years away, the recovery was still fragile. The future was uncertain, and the reckoning that would eventually force the public to re-examine everything it thought it knew about Amanda Bynes and the world that had produced her was still 6 years from arrival. But the silence was thinning. In corners of the internet, in conversations between former colleagues, in the slowly accumulating body of public testimony from other child star survivors, the conditions for a reckoning were assembling themselves with the patience of people who had waited decades to be heard. The cultural ground had shifted. Audiences that had once accepted celebrity dysfunction as entertainment were beginning to ask harder questions about the systems that produced it. The conversation about power and accountability that had reshaped other industries was slowly reaching children's entertainment, the last genre to be examined, perhaps because the impulse to protect the innocence of children's programming extended, unconsciously, to protecting the institutions that produced it from scrutiny. Somewhere, a production company was beginning to research the history of Nickelodeon's live action programs. Somewhere, former cast members and crew were being contacted and asked whether they would be willing to speak on camera about what they had experienced and witnessed. Somewhere, Drake Bell was considering whether the time had come to say his name aloud, to connect the man he had become to the boy whose identity had been sealed inside a court record, to take the most private fact of his life and make it the most public. The decision to speak would cost him whatever remained of the boundary between his trauma and the world's consumption of it. The decision not to speak would cost him the possibility that his testimony might protect children who were still inside the system, or at least force the system to acknowledge what it had allowed. Amanda Bynes was not part of those conversations. She was not contacted for the documentary that was being planned. Or if she was, she did not participate. She would not appear on camera. She would not tell her story in the format the public was about to receive the stories of others. Her absence from the reckoning that was coming, the reckoning that her face, her name, and her career had helped make inevitable, would become, when the documentary finally aired, the most eloquent silence in the room. A woman who had spent her childhood being watched by millions would be defined, at the moment of greatest public scrutiny, by her refusal to be watched again. The year was 2018. Schneider was out. Amanda was sober and trying to rebuild a life that had no precedent in her experience. Drake was carrying a sealed story that had shaped everything about him and that the world did not know. The former children of Nickelodeon were scattered across a country that still watched their old shows in reruns and remembered them with an affection that was about to become something far more complicated than nostalgia. The public did not yet know what had happened behind the orange logo. The parents did not fully know, the network did not want to know. But the people who had been there, who had been children there, who had performed and laughed and carried the weight of an empire on bodies and minds that were still forming, were beginning to remember. And memory, once it starts to organize itself, does not stop. It gathers, it connects. It finds other people who remember the same rooms, the same voices, the same feeling of something being wrong that no child had the language to name. And eventually it speaks. The conservatorship ended on March 22nd, 2022. A judge in Ventura County terminated the arrangement, restoring Amanda Bynes' control over her finances and personal decisions for the first time in nearly 9 years. Her parents supported the termination. Their support was not a formality. It was in the public record, at least, an acknowledgement that the person they had sought to protect in 2013 had recovered sufficiently to resume the governance of her own life. Amanda was 35 years old. She had been under conservatorship since she was 27. She had been under some form of institutional or parental authority over her professional life since she was 10. The judge's order did not restore 25 years of autonomy. It restored the legal possibility of autonomy, which is not the same thing, because a person who has spent a quarter of a century inside systems of adult control does not walk out of a courtroom and into an independent life fully formed. She walks into a life she has never lived as an unencumbered adult, and the work of building it, the habits of self-governance, the muscle memory of independent decision-making, the daily practice of being responsible for oneself after decades of being responsible to others, is work that no court order can perform on her behalf. The months that followed the conservatorship's end were, for Amanda, a period of cautious reemergence into a world that had continued turning without her. She reconnected with fans through social media, posting updates that were modest in scope and tone, photographs, brief messages, evidence of a life being lived quietly and without the chaos that had characterized the previous decade. She pursued fashion and creative work, a continuation of the design interest she had developed during her years at FIDM, where she had graduated in 2019 with a degree in merchandise product development. She was photographed occasionally, looking calm and present in ways that contrasted sharply with the tabloid images from a decade earlier. The public, which had watched her crisis with a mixture of fascination and concern and voyeuristic consumption, now watched her recovery with a gentler but no less consuming attention. Amanda Bynes was still, even in her mid-30s, a person whose private life was treated as public property, not because she had invited that treatment, but because the fame she had acquired as a child had never been fully returned to her. It followed her. It would always follow her. The girl who had made millions of children laugh was permanently visible, whether she wanted to be or not. That visibility was the last piece of the inheritance the industry had given her. And unlike the money or the career, it could not be placed under a conservatorship or terminated by a judge. But the world Amanda was re entering in 2022 was a different world from the one she had left. The cultural conversation about child stardom, about institutional power, about the mechanisms of control that operate inside the entertainment industry had shifted in the ways that would have been unimaginable during her Nickelodeon years. Audiences that had once accepted the industry's treatment of young performers as an unremarkable feature of celebrity culture were now asking questions that the industry had spent decades avoiding. The conservatorship debate, amplified by another high profile case that had consumed public attention throughout 2021, had forced Americans to reconsider the mechanisms of control that could be exercised over adults whose vulnerability had been created in part by the very industries that profited from them. The public had learned a new vocabulary: conservatorship, autonomy, exploitation, institutional complicity, and it was applying that vocabulary retroactively to cases it had previously dismissed as tabloid entertainment. Jeanette McCurdy's memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died, was published in August of 2022 and became a bestseller almost immediately. The title alone was a provocation, a statement so blunt and so raw that it forced the reader to reckon with the depth of harm a parent could inflict before the first page was turned. The book gave millions of readers an intimate, unflinching account of what a Nickelodeon childhood had actually looked like from the inside. The eating disorders enforced by a controlling mother, the calorie counting, the body scrutiny, the professional pressures, the emotional manipulation, the near total erasure of the daughter's independent self by a mother who experienced her child's career as her own redemption. McCurdy described a childhood in which her mother had used her talent as an instrument of financial and emotional control so complete that the daughter had almost no separate identity by the time the mother died. The book did not name Schneider directly in its most serious allegations, but it named the ecosystem, the children's television world in which young performers were managed by adults whose authority was unchecked and whose accountability was minimal. And it gave the public a framework for understanding that what had happened to Amanda Bynes was not an isolated personal tragedy. It was a pattern. It was a system. And the system had produced enough damage to fill a best-selling memoir by someone who had survived it. The ground was shifting beneath the Nickelodeon empire, though the empire itself seemed on the surface as solid as ever. The shows were still in reruns, broadcast on television, streamed on platforms, clipped and shared on social media in formats that reduced entire programs to the 30-second moments that had lodged in viewers' memories. The nostalgia was still powerful, perhaps more powerful than it had ever been. A generation that had grown up watching all that and The Amanda Show and Drake and Josh and iCarly was now in its 20s and 30s, old enough to revisit their childhood programming with adult eyes and young enough to feel a personal stake in what that programming had meant to them. The nostalgia economy was booming. Nickelodeon branded merchandise, reunion specials, throwback social media accounts, and content built on millennial and Gen Z childhood memories generated engagement and revenue with a reliability that the original programming had never quite achieved. The audience was being sold its own childhood, repackaged as comfort content, stripped of context, and presented as though the joy on screen had been the whole story, as though the laughter of the children performing the sketches had been as uncomplicated as the laughter of the children watching them. That comfort was about to be disrupted in a way that would make it impossible to consume the old footage in the old way ever again. The documentary had been in production for months before the public knew it existed. The producers at Maxine Productions had been researching the history of Nickelodeon's live-action programs with the methodical patience of investigators building a case, contacting former cast members and crew, conducting preliminary interviews, identifying the people who were willing to speak on the record, gathering archival footage that could be recontextualized through the lens of adult testimony. They were assembling the individual stories that had existed in isolation for years, in private conversations, in therapy sessions, in the quiet recollections of people who had never had a public forum in which to share them, into a single, coherent, devastating narrative. The project was called Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV, and it was commissioned by Investigation Discovery. The title itself was a subversion. Quiet on set is the command given before filming begins, the moment when the chaos of a production set resolves into the controlled silence of performance. In this context, it meant something else entirely. The silence that had been maintained for decades about what had happened when the cameras were rolling, and more importantly, when they were not. The first 4 episodes were scheduled to premiere on March 17th, 2024. In the days before the broadcast, promotional material began to circulate, trailers, press releases, social media previews that hinted at the scope of what was coming. The names attached to the documentary, former child stars, former writers, former crew members from some of the most beloved programs in the history of children's television, signaled that this was not a tabloid expose built on unnamed sources and speculation. This was on the record testimony from people who had been inside the system, people who had been children inside the system, people who had grown into adults and decided, after years or decades of private processing, that the time had come to speak. The anticipation built across the platforms where the nostalgia audience gathered, the people who had grown up with these shows, who remembered these faces, who had carried the catchphrases and theme songs of their childhood into adulthood as tokens of a simpler time, were about to learn that the world they remembered had contained rooms they had never been shown and dynamics they had never been told about. March 17th, 2024, a Sunday evening. The documentary aired across Investigation Discovery and streaming platforms. The first images were familiar: the orange logo, the bright sets, the children in costume, the sketch comedy, the laugh tracks, the audience participation, the slime. The visual language of Nickelodeon, the language of fun, of mess, of childhood liberation, was deployed with surgical precision because the documentary's power depended on the audience's pre-existing relationship with that language. The viewers needed to feel the warmth of the nostalgia before the documentary showed them what the nostalgia had been hiding. They needed to remember what it felt like to be 8 years old, sitting on a couch, watching these children perform and believing that the performance was the whole story. The documentary let them sit in that feeling for just long enough to make the transition unbearable. And then the adult faces appeared. Not the children the audience remembered, but the adults those children had become, seated in interview chairs, lit with the sober, unflattering directness of documentary cinematography, speaking in the careful, measured voices of people who had spent years, sometimes decades, deciding whether to say these things aloud. The transformation was visual as well as verbal. The children the audience had known were bright, energetic, costumed, performing. The adults before them now were still, serious, unadorned, testifying. The gap between those two images, the child performing and the adult remembering, was the gap the documentary existed to illuminate. Former writers described the writer's room as a place of intimidation, workplace bias, and inappropriate conduct. Christy Stratton said that working for Schneider had felt like being in a harmful relationship, a comparison that carried weight precisely because it came from an adult professional describing a professional environment, not from a tabloid headline. Jenny Kilgan corroborated the picture of a workplace in which the showrunner's authority was absolute and dissent was punished. Former crew members added their own accounts, layering detail upon detail until the portrait of a production culture emerged with a specificity that could not be dismissed as exaggeration or misremembering. The allegations were not vague. They were particular. Workplace bias, verbal intimidation, inappropriate behavior, the inappropriate framing of young performers in sketches and promotional material, workplace massage requests, and a management style that the documentary's press materials described as creating an environment involving mistreatment, workplace bias, racism, and inappropriate dynamics with child stars and crew. The documentary showed archival clips from the programs, clips that the audience remembered laughing at as children, clips that had been shared millions of times on social media as nostalgia content, and recontextualized them with the testimony of the people who had been present when they were made. Sketches that had seemed harmless in the context of a children's comedy show were, when examined through the lens of adult testimony about the workplace that produced them, revealed to carry undertones that a child audience would not have recognized, but that the adults writing, producing, and directing them could not have missed. A sketch involving a child in a suggestive position, a recurring bit that placed young performers in scenarios whose subtext was visible only to adult eyes. The audience was being asked to look at something it had already seen, something it had laughed at, something it had loved, and to see it differently. To recognize that the comedy they had consumed as children had been created inside a power structure that treated children as instruments, and that the humor had sometimes served purposes the children performing it could not have understood and had not consented to. But the documentary's devastating center, the section that transformed Quiet on Set from a workplace expose into a child safety reckoning, that shifted the conversation from uncomfortable to unbearable, was not the workplace allegations. It was Drake Bell. Bell appeared on camera and identified himself for the first time publicly as the unnamed young person in Brian Peck's 2003 criminal case. He was 37 years old. He had been carrying this story since he was 15, more than half his life, more than 2 decades of silence maintained not by choice, but by the architecture of a legal system that had protected his identity as a minor and, in doing so, had also protected the system that had produced his offender's access. The boy whose face had been on Nickelodeon posters and lunchboxes and magazine covers, whose guitar-playing charm had defined a generation's idea of the cool older brother, whose name was still synonymous with the easy laughter of a children's sitcom, sat in an interview chair and described, in the measured and sometimes halting language of a person returning to the worst experience of his life, being harmed by a man whose professional role had placed him in intimate, unsupervised contact with child performers. The room was quiet. The camera held steady. The face on the screen was not the teenage boy the audience remembered. It was a 37-year-old man whose eyes carried the weight of what that teenage boy had endured and what the decade since had cost him. Bell described the mechanics of access with a specificity that was itself a form of testimony. Peck was a dialogue coach. His professional role placed him in intimate, unsupervised, one-on-one contact with child performers, contact that was sanctioned by the production, expected by the parents, and invisible to the audience. He built relationships with families over time. He positioned himself as a trustworthy professional, a mentor, a person whose interest in a child's career was presented as benevolent and whose presence in a child's life was endorsed by the institution that employed them both. Bell said Peck had convinced his mother that the arrangement, Bell staying at Peck's home during audition trips to Los Angeles, spending extended time alone with Peck for dialogue work and career mentoring, was professional, beneficial, and in the child's best interest. The mother trusted the system. The system had given her no reason not to. The mistreatment occurred inside that structure of trust. It occurred because the structure made it possible, because a children's television network had credentialed an adult, placed him in proximity to children, and created the professional rationale for that proximity to extend beyond the set and into the private spaces where a child was most vulnerable. Bell described telling his mother what had happened. He described the weight of that conversation, a teenage boy finding the words to name something that every adult in his life had taught him to trust, something that the system had presented as safe and professional and benign. He described going to the police. He described the criminal investigation that followed, the arrest, the legal proceedings that reduced the worst experience of his childhood to charges, pleas, and sentences. Peck was arrested in 2003, pleaded no contest to charges connected to a younger person, and was sentenced in 2004 to 16 months in prison. He was required to register as a registered offender for the remainder of his life. Bell's identity as the victim was sealed by the court, a legal protection designed to shield a minor from public exposure, from the kind of scrutiny that could compound the harm already done. The seal preserved his privacy for 20 years, the entirety of his young adulthood, the years when he built a music career and a public persona that the seal record ensured would never be complicated by the truth. It also, by its nature, ensured that the public could not connect the crime to the system that had enabled it. For 2 decades, the viewing public had no way of knowing that one of the most recognized young performers on Nickelodeon had been harmed by a man the network had employed. The sealed record protected both the victim's anonymity and the institution's reputation. The documentary ended that protection not by violating the legal seal, but by Bell's own decision to speak. He chose, at 37, to do what the 15-year-old could not have done, to say publicly and on the record that a trusted adult inside the Nickelodeon system had harmed him, and that the system's structures of trust, access, and professional authority had created the conditions for that mistreatment to occur. The audience watched, 16 million viewers, according to later reports. 16 million people who had grown up with these shows, who had watched these performers as children, who had associated the orange logo with the uncomplicated happiness of their own early years, who had carried the catchphrases and theme songs and sketch characters into adulthood as tokens of innocence. They watched Drake Bell name what had happened to him. They watched former writers and performers describe a workplace culture that the nostalgia had erased from collective memory. They watched archival footage of children performing on sets that they now understood had contained dynamics the children could not have comprehended and that the adults had chosen not to name. And they noticed, as the documentary unfolded across its 4 initial episodes, an absence that was as powerful as any testimony, an absence that grew more visible with each passing hour as witness after witness appeared, and the one face the audience most expected to see remained missing. Amanda Bynes was not there. Her face appeared in archival footage. The 10-year-old on All That, the 13-year-old anchoring the Amanda show, the teenager whose comic timing had built an empire. But the footage was historical, a record of a childhood that had already ended. The adult Amanda, the 38-year-old woman who had survived the system and was now living privately in the aftermath of her conservatorship, did not sit for an interview. She did not tell her story. She did not participate. She did not offer the testimony that the audience, consciously or not, was waiting for. The testimony of the person whose name was most synonymous with the Nickelodeon era, whose talent had been the foundation of Schneider's early empire, whose crisis had been the most publicly visible consequence of growing up inside the machine. Her silence was not explained by the documentary. It did not need to be. The absence spoke for itself, and it said something that no amount of testimony could have said as effectively. The person who had spent her childhood being watched by millions had earned, through decades of suffering and recovery, the right to refuse to be watched again. Whether that choice was protective, deliberate, advised by counsel, or simply the decision of a woman who had spent enough of her life being consumed by a public that felt entitled to her, the audience could not know. But the absence sat at the center of the documentary like a held breath. And every other person's testimony was shaped, in part, by the testimony that was not given. The documentary was, in a sense, constructed around Amanda's absence, the way a photograph is constructed around the light it captures. What is visible depends on what is not. The immediate aftermath of the premiere was seismic in a way that few documentaries achieve. The series reached more than 16 million viewers across its initial broadcast and streaming release. It dominated social media for days. Former viewers shared their reactions: shock, grief, anger, the particular disorientation of having a childhood memory rewritten by adult knowledge. Parents who had let their children watch these programs felt a retrospective unease that could not be resolved by reassurance. The phrase "quiet on set" entered the cultural vocabulary as shorthand for institutional complicity, for the silence that surrounds harm committed against children in professional environments, for the gap between what the public sees and what the people inside the system experience. The conversation was not only about Nickelodeon. It was about every institution that places children in professional roles, every talent agency, every production company, every network, every stage school, every commercial shoot, every child modeling agency, and every parent who trusts those institutions to protect their child, and every viewer who consumes the product of that child's labor without asking what the labor cost. Dan Schneider responded within days. He released a lengthy video interview, not through a network or a documentary production, but through a controlled, self-produced format that allowed him to shape the terms of his own public statement, in which he addressed the allegations that Quiet on Set had laid before the public. He sat before the camera as a man who was no longer the industry's invisible powerhouse, but its most scrutinized subject, and he attempted to navigate the impossible terrain between acknowledgement and denial. He said the documentary had been difficult to watch. He apologized for some past behaviors. He acknowledged that workplace massages had occurred, that he had asked colleagues for physical massages in a professional setting, and that this was wrong. He acknowledged inappropriate conduct in writers' rooms he had led, including jokes and conversations that had no place in any workplace, and particularly not in one that produced content for children. He said he regretted behavior that had made people uncomfortable. He said he had not always been the leader he should have been, but the apology had boundaries, and those boundaries were drawn with legal precision. He denied any implication connecting him to harm involving young performers. He said the documentary had been edited to create a false association between his workplace behavior and Peck's crimes, that by placing testimony about management misconduct alongside testimony about serious harm, the filmmakers had constructed an implication that did not reflect reality. He recommended that studios employ licensed therapists on sets with minors, a suggestion that carried a particular weight given the context. The man who had run children's sets for 2 decades without any such safeguard was now, in the wake of a documentary about the harm that had occurred on those sets, recommending the very protections whose absence had helped define the environment he had created. He also clarified his relationships with Drake Bell and Amanda Bynes, pushing back on the documentary's framing of those relationships while maintaining that he had cared about the children who worked for him. The public received his response with a skepticism that was not uniform but was widespread. The apologies for many viewers felt partial, an acknowledgement of the least serious allegations designed to draw a bright line before the more serious ones. The denials felt defensive. The recommendation for on-set therapists felt, to many, like an inadvertent confession that the environment he had overseen for decades had needed exactly the kind of intervention he had never provided. The response video became its own cultural artifact, discussed and parsed and debated alongside the documentary itself, adding another layer to a reckoning that was growing more complex with every public statement. Nickelodeon issued its own institutional response. The network said it could not corroborate or negate allegations from decades earlier, but that it investigated formal complaints and had adopted new safeguards for minors on its current productions. The language was careful, measured, and almost perfectly calibrated to acknowledge concern without admitting responsibility. The language of a corporation processing reputational risk rather than the language of an institution grappling candidly with what it had allowed to happen inside its walls. The statement did not name Schneider, it did not name Peck, it did not name any specific child performer. It existed in the abstract space of institutional communication, where harm is acknowledged in principle, but never in particular, and where the word safeguards substitutes for the more difficult question of why such safeguards had not existed during the decades when the harm was occurring. In May of 2024, Schneider filed his defamation lawsuit against the makers of Quiet on Set. He alleged that the documentary had wrongly implied he had harmed child actors, an implication he said was false, damaging to his reputation, and deliberately constructed through editorial choices that juxtaposed his image and testimony about his workplace conduct with testimony about Peck's criminal, serious harm of a minor. The lawsuit moved the reckoning from the court of public opinion into an actual courtroom, where the questions of what had been alleged, what had been implied, what had been true, and what the boundary was between fair commentary and defamatory implication would be subjected to legal scrutiny. The case transformed the documentary from a cultural event into a contested legal document, and it ensured that the questions Quiet on Set had raised would not be resolved quickly, cleanly, or to anyone's complete satisfaction. The documentary had generated enough public demand that a fifth episode was produced, Breaking the Silence, hosted by journalist Soledad O'Brien, in which former child stars, including Drake Bell and Shane Lyons, discussed the industry, the documentary's impact, and the ongoing work of reckoning with childhood spent inside a system that the public was only now beginning to understand. The fifth episode was added because the response to the first four demanded continuation. The audience was not satisfied with a 4-hour reckoning. It wanted more. It wanted resolution, accountability, structural reform, and the feeling that the harm described on screen would lead to changes that would protect the next generation of child performers. Whether that desire could be met was a question that no documentary, however devastating, could answer on its own. The world had finally heard some of what had happened behind the orange logo. But hearing is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as repair. The children who had been inside the machine were adults now. They had spoken or chosen not to speak, and the public had listened or consumed or debated or moved on to the next event in the cultural cycle. The brand had issued its statement. The producer had filed his lawsuit. The former performers had returned to their lives, lives that now included the knowledge that their private experiences had become public record, that the most painful chapters of their childhoods had been broadcast to millions, and that the reckoning they had waited decades for had arrived not as justice, not as closure, but as content consumed by the same audience that had consumed their childhood performances. And Amanda Bynes, whose face had started everything, whose talent had built the first floor of the empire, whose absence from the documentary had been its most eloquent silence, was somewhere outside the frame, living, recovering, not speaking, not performing, not available to be consumed. The reckoning had come and gone, around her like weather, and she had stood inside it without making a sound. The reckoning did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. It continued in the days and weeks and months that followed the documentary's broadcast, not as a single coherent movement toward accountability, but as a scattered, contested, unresolved series of responses that revealed as much about the public's relationship to childhood nostalgia as it did about the system the documentary had described. 16 million people had watched Quiet on Set. They had seen the testimony. They had seen the archival footage recontextualized. They had seen Drake Bell name what had happened to him. They had heard former writers describe a workplace that bore no resemblance to the cheerful, child-centered environment the public had imagined. And now they were left with a question that the documentary had posed but could not by itself answer. What happens next? What does a society do with the knowledge that an institution it trusted with its children was, in significant ways, failing those children? What does it owe the people who were harmed? And what does it change to ensure that the harm is not repeated? The answer, as it unfolded across 2024 and into 2025, was many things, none of them sufficient, all of them incomplete. The public conversation was loud and impassioned in the weeks after the premiere. Social media platforms were saturated with discussions of Schneider, Nickelodeon, child star exploitation, and the structural failures that had allowed harm to occur inside an institution dedicated to children's entertainment. Viewers posted their own recollections of sketches they now saw differently, of moments in their favorite programs that they had never questioned as children, but that now, through the lens of the documentary's testimony, carried undertones they could not unsee. Parents who had raised children on Nickelodeon programming in the 2000s confronted the retroactive unease of having trusted a system that they now learned had not always deserved that trust. Teachers and youth workers recognized the dynamics described in the documentary: the trusted adult, the institutional credentialing, the access facilitated by professional roles, as dynamics that existed not only in children's television, but in every setting where adults hold authority over children. The conversation was necessary. It was urgent. It was also, by its nature, temporary. Public attention is a finite resource, governed by the same economy of novelty and fatigue that governs the entertainment industry itself. And the cycle of outrage and discussion and diminishment operates on a timeline measured in weeks, not years. By the summer of 2024, the intensity of the initial response had faded, replaced by the steady background awareness that the documentary had permanently altered, but that the machinery of daily life had already begun to absorb and normalize. The legal dimension remained active and adversarial. Schneider's defamation lawsuit against the documentary's producers was proceeding through the courts, transforming the questions the documentary had raised from matters of public discussion into matters of legal dispute, a transformation that carried its own costs, because legal proceedings move slowly, produce ambiguous outcomes, and translate human testimony into the language of evidence and admissibility and burden of proof. The suit alleged that the filmmakers had deliberately created an association between Schneider and harm involving young performers through editorial juxtaposition and implication, and that this association was false and damaging to his reputation and livelihood. The documentary's producers would have to defend not only what they had directly stated, but what they had implied through structure, sequencing, and the placement of testimony, a distinction that is central to defamation law and that would require the courts to examine the documentary not as a cultural event, but as a constructed text whose editorial choices carried legal consequences. The case ensured that the questions raised by Quiet on Set would not be settled by public opinion alone. It also ensured that the reckoning would be prolonged, expensive, and adversarial, a legal contest rather than the communal process of accountability that the documentary's subjects might have hoped their testimony would produce. The system itself, the children's television industry, the network structures, the production companies, the talent agencies, the studios, responded with this selective, incremental reform that institutions typically offer when confronted with evidence of historical harm. Nickelodeon's statements about new safeguards for minors acknowledged that protections could be improved without admitting that the old protections had failed in specific documented ways. The broader conversation about child performers' welfare produced calls for legislative reform, for mandatory licensed therapists on sets employing minors, for limits on unsupervised adult access to child performers, for independent oversight mechanisms that would exist outside the production hierarchy, for changes to the labor laws that govern child performers' working hours and conditions. Whether those calls would translate into durable structural change remained, as of 2025, an open question. Institutions reform at the pace of institutional self-interest, not at the pace of public outrage. And the history of child performer protection in the American entertainment industry is a history of reforms that arrive after the harm has already been done, that address the specific failures that became public, and that leave the underlying power structures, the financial incentives, the access dynamics, the dependency relationships between children and the adults who employ them, largely intact. The Coogan Act, passed in 1939 to protect child performers' earnings after Jackie Coogan's parents spent his childhood fortune, was itself a response to harm that had already occurred. The California legislation that governed child performers' working hours and set conditions was, similarly, a product of past failures codified into law after the damage had been documented. Nearly a century after the Coogan Act, the fundamental dynamic had not changed. Children generated value, adults controlled the value, and protections were added only after the cost of their absence became undeniable. Quiet on Set was the latest iteration of that pattern, a public revelation of harm that had already been inflicted, a demand for reform that was, by definition, too late for the children it was about. The 10-year-old Amanda Bynes, who walked onto the All That Set in 1996, could not be protected retroactively. The 15-year-old Drake Bell, who stayed at Brian Peck's house, could not be protected retroactively. The reforms that might follow the documentary would protect future children if they were enacted and enforced and maintained against the industry's natural tendency to resist oversight. But for the generation of performers whose testimony the documentary had relied upon, the reform would arrive as confirmation of what they had always known. The system had failed them, and the system was only willing to acknowledge that failure after they, as adults, had done the work of making the failure impossible to deny. The fates of the people at the center of this story diverged in the years after the documentary in ways that reflected the different positions they had occupied inside the system and the different kinds of damage the system had produced. A child star's aftermath is not the same as a showrunner's aftermath, which is not the same as a convicted offender's aftermath, which is not the same as a parent's aftermath, which is not the same as an audience's aftermath. The documentary had, for a brief moment, brought all of these people into the same frame, connected them through the shared architecture of a system that had shaped all of their lives. But the moment passed, and they returned to separate trajectories, carrying separate versions of the same history and facing separate consequences for the roles they had played or been assigned within it. What follows is not a resolution. It is an accounting, an attempt to track, with the specificity and care these people deserve, where each of them ended up after the cameras turned away from them for what may be the last time. Amanda Bynes remained out of acting. She had not returned to performance, and by the available public record showed no indication of wanting to. Her life after the conservatorship was defined not by the grand gestures of a public comeback, but by small, deliberate steps toward a private, creative existence that bore almost no resemblance to the career that had consumed her childhood. In 2024, she collaborated with designer Austin Babbitt on a collection of pieces featuring her original artwork, hand-drawn designs that Amanda had created herself, art that existed entirely outside the entertainment industry, that required no audience, no camera, no performance, and no negotiation with the machinery that had defined her first 24 years of life. She had graduated from FYDM in 2019. She had fashion ambitions that were modest in scale but significant in what they represented, a former child star attempting to build an identity based on what she could create rather than on what she could perform. In 2025, Amanda launched a subscription platform account, which generated immediate tabloid attention and public speculation, the reflexive assumption that a former child star on a platform associated with major content must be doing something scandalous. She clarified that the account was intended for chatting with fans and sharing content, not for posting restricted material. The clarification was itself a testament to the way the public continued to interpret Amanda Bynes through the lens of spectacle rather than agency. A woman in her late 30s chose to engage with a digital platform on her own terms, and the immediate public response was to project its own assumptions onto that choice. The assumption was wrong, but its persistence demonstrated something that the documentary had shown from a different angle. The public that had watched Amanda grow up in camera still felt entitled to interpret her choices, still projected its own narratives onto her decisions, and still struggled to see her as a person whose choices belonged to her rather than as a character in a story the public believed it owned. Also in 2025, Amanda publicly denied a fabricated claim that had gone viral on TikTok, a claim involving Schneider that she said was false and manipulated. That moment was brief but significant because it demonstrated the way public concern about child star exploitation could mutate in the unregulated ecosystem of social media into harmful speculation about living people. The documentary had opened a necessary conversation, but the internet does not distinguish between documented testimony and fabricated rumor, and the same audience that had been moved by quiet on set was capable of generating and amplifying falsehoods about the very people the documentary had sought to protect. Amanda's denial was a reminder that the aftermath of a reckoning is not always healing. Sometimes it is another form of the same intrusion, another set of strangers claiming to know her story better than she does. Drake Bell's life after the documentary was the life of a person whose most private trauma had become his most public identity, a transformation he had chosen but whose consequences he could not fully control. The man who had been known for decades as a charming teenage television star, a musician with a loyal following, a fixture of millennial nostalgia, was now known primarily as a survivor of childhood harm, whose testimony had anchored a national conversation about children's entertainment. That transformation was in one sense an act of extraordinary courage. The decision to surrender the privacy that the sealed court record had protected for 20 years, to connect his adult face to the child's sealed name, to give the reckoning the moral weight that only a victim's direct testimony can provide. In another sense, it was a loss. The loss of the right to be known for anything other than the worst thing that had happened to him. The loss of a public identity that, however incomplete, had at least been his to define. Bell had spoken because he believed the public needed to hear what the system had allowed. The cost of that speech was that the speech became the defining fact of his public life, eclipsing the music, the acting, the decades of work that had followed his Nickelodeon years, and the complex, sometimes troubled, sometimes triumphant life he had lived as an adult. He had connected his childhood trauma to ongoing mental health and substance use struggles, and the public, in processing that connection, often reduced a complicated life to a single causal story. He was harmed, therefore he struggled. That story was not wrong, but it was incomplete, because no person's life can be reduced to a single cause, and the tendency to do so, however compassionately intended, is itself a form of the dehumanization that the documentary had sought to challenge. Dan Schneider's aftermath remained contested, unresolved, and defined by a tension that the legal system would eventually have to adjudicate, but that the court of public opinion had already processed in its own imperfect way. He had apologized for some behaviors, the workplace massages, the inappropriate writer's room conduct, the management style that had made people uncomfortable, while denying, categorically and with legal force, any involvement in or facilitation of harm involving young performers. He had filed a defamation lawsuit that was, as of the latest available reporting, still proceeding through the courts. He had recommended reforms, licensed therapists on sets, improved safeguards for child performers, that implicitly acknowledged that the environment he had overseen for decades had lacked the protections he was now advocating. His legacy was permanently bifurcated. The credits that listed him as the creator of some of the most beloved and commercially successful children's programs in American television history coexisted with the testimony of people who had worked under him and described a professional environment that was, by their accounts, intimidating, biased, inappropriate, and harmful to both children and adults. The cultural judgment was not unanimous. He retained defenders who argued that the documentary had been editorially unfair, that the juxtaposition of his workplace misconduct with Peck's crimes constituted an implied accusation the facts did not support, and that his acknowledged mistakes did not warrant the severity of the public response. But the weight of the testimony and the specificity of the allegations and the sheer number of people willing to speak on the record had permanently altered the meaning of his name in a way that no lawsuit could fully reverse. Dan Schneider was no longer simply the man who had made Nickelodeon's live-action comedies. He was the man whose empire had been examined and found to contain rooms the public had never been shown. Lynn and Bynes remained private figures, and that privacy should be honored in a story that has asked difficult questions about people whose public record is limited and whose private experiences belong to them. Their roles in Amanda's story are documented at specific points. Parents of a child star who entered an industry neither of them had built or controlled. Adults navigating the impossible position of parenting a working child whose professional world was designed to marginalize parental judgment. Later, conservators of an adult daughter in crisis, exercising legal authority that the courts had granted and that the family had sought. And, in Amanda's own words, people who helped her recover. Whatever they experienced during the decades of Amanda's fame, crisis, conservatorship, and recovery, whatever private conversations occurred in the kitchen of the house in Thousand Oaks, or wherever the family gathered, whatever doubts surfaced at 3 in the morning, whatever guilt or relief or exhaustion or love accumulated in the quiet spaces between public incidents, belongs to them. The narrative cannot assign them roles they did not audition for and cannot attribute to them motives that the public record does not support. What can be said is that they were parents of a child star in a system that was not designed to support parents, that they later became conservators of a daughter the system had helped damage, that the daughter herself described them as her rescuers, and that they supported the end of the conservatorship when the time came. That testimony, Amanda's own, given freely in 2018, this is the most authoritative voice available on the subject of Lynn and Rick Bynes, and it should be the last word this story speaks about them. Brian Peck was convicted and served his sentence. He was required to register as a registered offender. His name, after the documentary, became synonymous with the specific horror of trusted adult access. The proof that a children's television network had employed a man who used his professional role to gain proximity to children and who used that proximity to commit a crime against a child. His case was not ambiguous. It was adjudicated, sentenced, and documented. What it demonstrated, more powerfully than any workplace culture allegation, was the lethal combination of institutional trust and individual predation. A system that assumed its credentialed adults were safe, a family that trusted the system's assumptions, and a child who paid the price for everyone else's faith. The cultural afterlife of the Nickelodeon empire existed, after Quiet on Set, in a state of permanent double vision. The shows were still in reruns, broadcast on television, streamed on platforms, shared in clips on social media. The nostalgia remained marketable because nostalgia is resilient, and because the emotional attachment a person forms to a program they watched at 8 years old is not easily overridden by information acquired at 35. Viewers continued to watch the old episodes, they continued to share the clips, they continued to quote the catchphrases and reference the characters with the affectionate familiarity of people revisiting their own childhoods. But the emotional register of that nostalgia had changed in a way that could not be fully reversed. A viewer who watched an old episode of The Amanda Show now watched it with the knowledge that the child on screen would later struggle with body dysmorphia, substance misuse, and a conservatorship that lasted nearly a decade. A viewer who watched Drake and Josh now watched it with the knowledge that one of the two boys on screen had been harmed by an adult the production had employed. A viewer who watched all that now watched it knowing that former performers would later allege that the workplace in which those sketches were produced had been characterized by dynamics the children performing them could not have understood or challenged. The shows had not changed. A single frame had not been altered. But the audience had changed, and the gap between what the shows had meant in the 1990s and 2000s and what they meant now, the gap between the laughter of a child audience and the testimony of adult survivors, was a gap that no amount of nostalgia could close. Quiet on Set itself became part of the cultural record, not merely a documentary about a specific industry, but a document in the ongoing American conversation about what children are owed by the institutions that profit from their talents, their images, and their labor. Its 16 million viewers, its 5 episodes, its social media afterlife, the legal proceedings it generated, and the conversations it provoked in living rooms and classrooms and legislative offices across the country ensured that the questions it raised would persist beyond the initial broadcast cycle. The documentary did not resolve those questions. It could not. Resolution would require systemic change of a kind that no 4-hour television program can produce. What it did was open the questions in a way that made them impossible to close again. And the opening was, itself, a form of change. Not the structural reform that the most damaged survivors might have hoped for. Not the justice that the legal system might or might not deliver. But the slower, less visible, more durable change that occurs when a public that had accepted a system as benign looks at the evidence, and recognizes that the benignity was, in significant part, a function of its own ignorance. Amanda Bynes is 39 years old now, as of April 2026. She lives outside the entertainment industry, pursuing fashion and creative work on a scale that would be invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. She does not act. She does not give interviews about her Nickelodeon years. She has not spoken publicly about Quiet on Set or its revelations. She has not participated in the ongoing public conversation about child star exploitation, despite being the person whose name is most closely associated with the Nickelodeon era in the public imagination. Her life, as it is visible to the public through the narrow aperture of social media and occasional press reports, is a life of deliberate privacy, of small creative projects, of the ongoing and unglamorous work of being a person who was once the most famous child in America and who has chosen, in adulthood, to be something quieter and less consumed. She graduated from FIDM. She collaborated with designers. She launched a platform for fan interaction. She denied false rumors when they threatened to pull her back into the machinery of public speculation. Each of these choices is modest. Each is also, in context, an act of self determination by a woman who spent the first 3.5 decades of her life having her choices made, interpreted, and consumed by others. She is the absence at the center of this story, the person whose talent built the first floor of the empire, whose crisis was the most visible consequence of the empire's failures, and whose silence, maintained through the reckoning and beyond it, is the most powerful statement she has made since she stopped performing. Whether that silence represents peace or protection or exhaustion or wisdom or something more complicated than any single word can contain, only she can know. What the public can see is a woman who has survived and who is living on terms that appear at last to be her own. Drake Bell is 39. He continues to make music and to navigate a public life that has been permanently reshaped by his documentary testimony. He tours, he records, he engages with fans who knew him first as a teenage television character and who now know him as a man who survived something that the character never hinted at. He is a survivor of childhood harm, whose courage in speaking publicly gave the reckoning its moral weight and its emotional center, and whose life, since the documentary, has been shaped by the cost of that courage, and by the ongoing work of living as a person whose worst experience is now his most widely known characteristic. He connected the trauma of his childhood to mental health and substance use struggles that continued into adulthood, and his trajectory remains the trajectory of a person for whom the documentary did not end when the cameras turned off. It continues in every interview, every public appearance, every moment when a stranger recognizes his face and connects it not to the guitar and the grin and the sitcom, but to the testimony he gave in an interview chair at 37, naming what had been done to him before he was old enough to protect himself. Dan Schneider is in his late 50s. His defamation lawsuit against the producers of Quiet on Set is part of the public record and remains, as of this telling, unresolved. His legacy is contested in a way that may never be fully settled, because the legal process will produce a verdict on the specific question of defamation, and the cultural process will produce a broader judgment on the question of responsibility, and those two outcomes may not align. Courts determine what was said and whether it was false. Culture determines what was built and whether the person who built it should be held accountable for the environment that existed within it. He remains a figure defined by the intersection of extraordinary professional accomplishment and serious public allegations, a person whose credits include some of the most watched and most beloved children's programs in American history, and whose name now triggers, for millions of viewers who grew up with those programs, an association with the documentary that examined the cost of the environment in which they were made. His story is not finished. The lawsuit will proceed. The cultural judgment will evolve. And the tension between what he created and what the documentary alleged about the creation will remain unresolved for as long as anyone remembers the shows and the testimony that followed them. Lori Beth Denberg, Christy Stratton, Jenny Kilgan, Giovanni Samuels, Brian Hearn, Katrina Johnson, Kyle Sullivan, Shane Lyons, the chorus of witnesses and survivors returned to their lives after the documentary, carrying the knowledge that their testimony had contributed to a national conversation and the awareness that a national conversation is not the same as justice, is not the same as healing, and is not the same as the childhood they did not get to have. Each of them had been a child inside the machine. Each had grown into an adult who chose, at a specific moment in 2024, to speak or to be seen. Their names may fade from public awareness as the documentary recedes into the cultural archive and the news cycle replaces one story with the next. But the experiences they describe, the workplace dynamics, the power imbalances, the trusted adults whose trust was misplaced, the institutional silence that protected reputations at the expense of children, are not unique to Nickelodeon. They are the experiences of children inside professional structures across the entertainment industry, and the testimony these former performers provided will remain relevant as long as the industry continues to employ children in roles that place them under the authority of adults whose power is structurally difficult to challenge and whose accountability is structurally easy to avoid. There is no neat moral to this story. There is no single villain whose removal would have prevented the harm, no single decision that would have protected every child, no institutional reform that would have eliminated the fundamental tension at the heart of child stardom, that a child's talent is valuable to adults, and that the adult's interest in exploiting that talent will always structurally exceed their capacity to protect the child from the consequences of being valuable. A child star system can make everyone feel close to a child while leaving the child profoundly alone. Parents close enough to sign papers, but not always close enough to see the full machinery. Producers close enough to shape a career, but too powerful to be questioned by the people whose livelihoods depend on them. Viewers close enough to love a performance, but too far away to know what the performance cost the person delivering it. The adults make the decisions. The children absorb the consequences. The cost is always deferred to the next generation, or to the next cast, or to the next bright eyed 10-year-old who walks onto a set and makes a room full of adults lean closer. What remains after the documentary and the testimony and the lawsuit and the public debate and the social media cycle and the slow fade of public attention is the image that started everything and that will outlast everything. A girl on a brightly lit stage, 10 years old, making millions of children laugh, while the adults around her built futures out of a childhood she could not get back.